There you go. Okay.
Do you know how long it takes for people to generally join?
Yeah, well, that's why I was asking. There are normally more people here, so I indeed thought I got the wrong link initially. So that's why I was asking, is this a special meeting? That's
Oh, no, I mean, this was announced, the email got sent. We can wait a little longer. I'm not the one who has to let people in, right?
right. No, well, I've been letting people in, so I can certainly do that. It may be because it's the Easter holidays and children off school and the like, but yeah, let's just wait for. Oh no, it's 5 minutes. It's 14:35 here. I recommend we start and record it, and then those people who want to catch up can watch the recording. I think that's the best thing.
All right, so just so you know, Sonia, this is recorded and it will be made available, but only upon request. So generally what the meeting is 40 minutes presentation and then 30 minutes Q&A, which in this case will mostly be Carl. And so they say to encourage everyone to turn their camera on, but like I think it's Carl likes his camera off for a while. And so before you start, do introduce yourself, and then you can start.
Thank you. Great. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I hope that if it's only the three of us, that we will have a fruitful discussion, or that we can maybe end a bit earlier so that you can still make it for the Q&A part. Yeah, so a little bit about my background, which is quite eclectic. I grew up in Buenos Aires. I currently live in Rotterdam, and throughout my life, kind of estimating that everything is connected to everything has led me to have become quite the obsessive explorer, or kind of cross-domain master of no domain in particular. I'm currently transitioning from PhD, sorry, to postdoc, and my subject there as a PhD has been the concept of artificial intelligence, particularly in the realm of natural language processing, which has led to a little bit of what I will present today. And my background is very much in the overlaps between the arts and the sciences. In the context of the MA and the RMA that I followed, I focused on the notion of objectivity mostly, and scientific representation through both continental and analytic narratives in philosophy. And I'm learning, I have learned so much, and I'm still learning so much from the active inference community. So thank you so much, Mao, for inviting me, and for the recent exchanges also with Daniel and with Shanna. My future interests are in the domain of neuroendocrinology. So if there is anyone watching this later in that realm, please get in touch. This is for highly contingent reasons, which is why I also had to postpone this meeting from the moment it was planned earlier. Anyway, so I'm putting the abstract here as this wall of text now just for recording purposes, so that it's in the record later. But we can go through it a little bit here. And what I want to say is that, okay, so in this presentation, we will try to look at intelligence through active inference as a dynamic interplay between model complexity and performed simplification. The analysis is motivated by a desire to challenge contemporary AI discourse that dismisses mere pattern recognition as a subordinate cognitive function, and to challenge proposals that simplification is the trademark of scientific explanation. So I will propose that intelligence can be understood as the systemic organized capacity to adapt by traversing pattern hierarchies. So intelligence not only resolves complex patterns, as we know, into simple ones, which would be exploitation, but crucially, it also explodes simplicity into complexity, right? So it explores, it learns from novelty, it seeks surprise. So we frame here simplicity as the predictive spatiotemporal compression, summarization, reduction of things, and complexity as the designation of, or as pattern intractability or unpredictability itself. Patterns are sensitivities to difference that constitute the fundamental substrate of perception. And the intelligible domain is therefore circumscribed by what I call patternability, right? That which can be recursively, iteratively mapped. And that which resists patterning kind of remains outside the scope of the intelligible. So to frame this effect, I introduced the concept of negintelligibility, a kind of meta pattern that can be speculatively understood as an attractor driving intelligent systems toward perpetual pattern restructuring. So drawing this analogy with negentropy, the argument would be that negintelligibility operates within negentropic systems, compelling intelligence to continually remodel established patterns against persistent epistemic barriers. And these can be understood as presentations of novelty, noise, excesses, negativities, absences, catastrophic limits, symmetry breakings, nominal limitations, and other phenomena. This is like a super, super, super huge umbrella term. So the theoretical speculation would suggest that intelligence fundamentally operates through these bidirectional translations between simplicity and complexity, a metastable condition driven by this kind of negintelligible attractor, something which resists final pattern stabilization. And through various examples and comparisons to other proposals, I will try to show how this can offer novel insights into the possible naturalization of intelligence learning, the limits of knowability, and how, well, basically showing how science and philosophy have similar systematic goals, but arrive at conclusions through different avenues. The outline will be, we'll look at the concepts of accuracy and simplicity, intelligence and patterns, complexity and simplicity, expansion and reduction, mortal computation and negintelligibility. Negintelligibility, this is going to get difficult, I already know, as an attractor. Eruption theory and the Rebus model, the concept of correlation, and the concepts of abstraction and philosophical and scientific progress, as I mentioned, rebuttals and reconsiderations of what I will propose, and then further speculations through the notion of mechanical objectivity and perfection. So, accuracy and simplicity. This citation here reflects the starting point of my incursion. So, of course, this pertains to what we call intelligence and why we would need perhaps a concept such as negintelligibility, which can be simply, for now, for starting purposes, described as that which resists intelligibility. Coarse graining is, of course, context sensitive and observer dependent. No model is accurate unless it's dead, right? Which means that adaptive learning settles itself through historical constraints, which are conceptually very, very complex. So while loyally following much of what is proposed here by Carl and others, the contention that I have with much of AGI research would be that the focus in modeling usually remains at the kind of schematic bottom-up concept level, like the concept of dog, for example, or the concept of navigating a space, narrow domain object description type concepts, but there is much needed attention to the more complex concepts, which highlight the very dialogical and socially extended nature of thought, where agents need to trust each other in order for meaning to ensue. A concept like ideology, for example, is one where one really hits the ground running in terms of structure learning there. It's this sort of the learning of what it is happening at a very different scale than in the kind of object realist sense when we think about a concept like a dog and encounters with everyday objects. With complex concepts, correlation and causation are very, very cyclically confused. We often actually start using concepts and exploring their actualization as we couple to dialogical networks. And these concepts are, of course, notoriously in the making rather than already sedimented. So yeah, what we seem to call intelligence then is undeniably a complex recursive system, one in which conceptual unfolding reflects its permanently moving goalposts. It involves recognition and communication, and therefore more than a single agent, of course. And for us, recognition is communicated through natural and formal language systems. Like any other complex system, intelligence has tendencies, and these tendencies have been presented mostly in terms of general capacities, right? So like flexible adaptation abilities, cross-domain literacy, or in general, what I would classify as successful exploration or risk engagement. But of course, the exploration of what? To kind of simply bind this exploration to the idea of uncertainty seems a little bit too flat when we want to speak generally. If we imagine an analogy between, for example, a single agent as composed of cells and organs driven by a multiplicity of attractors, we can also imagine intelligence itself as a distributed system which has attractors, must have attractors too. So our interest here, given the observation that intelligence seems to elude specific observation or definition and is otherwise, like most other concepts, actually quite a normative concept, we can perhaps access the language of complex dynamical systems to understand it is not a quality possessed by agents, but a process occurring across agents and driven by an attractor, right? Which we call here the negintelligible. And the analysis level here is definitely extremely coarse-grained. I am in the context of philosophy after all, but I really do believe that it is precisely through the interactions between the coarse-grained, the most general level, and the fine-grained and the local that we arrive at novelty and regeneration. And this is, of course, in biology in general and in cognition in particular. And this is, of course, a joke about generality and specificity. So my definition of intelligence would be a complex network of interacting abstractions where abstractions are recognizable and thus compressible patterns that hold for long enough periods of observer-dependent relevance. Intelligence, then, is the observed read-write interplay between patterns, and observers therefore enable the possibility of patterns. Patterns recur as this sensitivity to difference, information, right? And any possibility for sensitivity is synthetic and therefore abstracts. A lot of this may be stating the obvious, or there may be refutations to be made, as it's highly relativistic, of course. But in any case, the obvious needs to be stated before really beginning. So, organisms, as minimizing variational or expected free energy, actively engage in their environments to gather information, to seek out preferred observations like food, water, shelter, social support, and avoid non-preferred observations, so tissue damage, hunger, thirst, social rejection. I agree, but the strange thing is, in the context of the thing we call intelligence, is that it has very contradicting tendencies. For example, self or social castigation, damage, and different levels of contradiction are all inherent to the intelligent project, whether it be at the level of social rejection of supposedly non-intelligent individuals in specific settings, to highly risky experiments in which Markov blankets are attempted to be peered behind. And here on the right, we have an example only in fiction. But in reality, this still continues to exist very much in the realm of animal testing, of course, and arguably still the case in human testing and also for much of history, which has, for example, led to a lot of our intelligence metrics. This is something to be it's important to be continually reminded of. The kind of complexity-simplicity dialectics that I want to underline here, which is, again, so something implicit in active inference. And here we can find sort of also in the context of philosophy in Malabou, who's a philosopher, reflecting on Dewey and Piaget's concept of intelligence. This is really not unlike the description of most AI researchers today, where cross-domain, again, generalization, abstraction, synthesis, and risk-taking for future gains is kind of the trademark of intelligence, supposedly. Of course, we know that a complex adaptive model can be flexible enough to include a wide range of latent possibilities. But of course, model actualization always results through action, through hypothesis testing, intervention, information exchange, in the simplification, the collapse of ambiguities. And this process is cyclical, continuous, and in large-scale systems can be understood as reflected in the motions of scientific paradigms and how they change, the moving of technological goalposts, the evolution of concepts, the changing of sociocultural frameworks. It would seem to me then that much like at the level of the predictive organism as a singular entity, once something is understood, simplified that is, it becomes evidence for how other things ought to be reconceived. And this leads to inevitable complexification, if only by mere recombination and the arrow of time, right? So concepts as illusions is how I like to frame our understanding of concepts as kind of, and illusions as a kind of intuition pump for how we have capacities to see as and sort of stack up these different abstracting levels. to see as and see as and see as, etc. To reason by elimination, as in the example here in the simulation, resulting in the avoidance of state duplication through the introduction of a new concept, is something that we can understand as being solicited by the outside and therefore existing as an attractor for modal adjustment rather than being something intrinsic to the agent itself. And I think this would make sense in the context of a perspective in which learning basic schematic concept categories first appears in order to facilitate learning more specific concepts later. This is a citation from the paper here by Carl and others on concept on structural learning. So we need large-scale global understandings in order to tune model granularity later, depending on the presented needs and goals. A concept such as negintelligibility designates a vast domain and can thus perhaps retune what exactly it is that we are subject to when we encounter absences, unexplainables, contradictions, etc. And these things are not the same, but under one umbrella can certainly be understood in a novel light. And please do note that this is not the proposal of something new. So negintelligibility is basically just the idea of conceptual change under the constraint of entropy. But it's a proposal to speak differently about comparable phenomena and to combine fields. So to combine philosophy with cognitive science, to combine logic with different understandings of negation in biology, for example. So because concepts direct our attention, think about something like neurodivergence or Anthropocene or polycomputation or allostasis. These concepts enhance our capacity to witness phenomena. So the creation of novel categories turns what might have been rendered as noise into some kind of signal, perhaps. Concepts signal to different dimensions of granularity, and here the negintelligible designates a radically coarse, grained attempt to capture the notion of uncertainty or indeterminacy as that which attracts patterning and formalization. So we could compare this to how allostasis as a concept captures homeostatic metastability through vaster spatiotemporal coarse graining. I will skip a little bit about where the joke in the name comes from. I made a joke to Henk de Recht when he was presenting his book, which won the Lakatos Prize in 2019, Understanding Scientific Understanding. He wanted to think about how to think about intelligibility in the context of negentropic systems, and I said you should call it negintelligibility, and then I ran with the concept myself. So thinking about nested hierarchies of exchanges between levels of complexity, right? Complex systems display so-called emergent behaviors, properties, following statistical laws, which appear to result from micro-level dynamics, leading to qualitative changes. Coarse graining microstates is what leads to the possibility of analysis of the macrostates in terms of different scales, right? The qualitative difference between a single bird and a bird flock as a complex system can be understood without even reference to modeling formalizations if we simply point out the phenomenal effect of uncertainty minimization in the visual tracking of the bird flock, where witnessing it as a system is less costly than tracking all the individual birds, right? So, however, notice that in tracking the flock, we also interestingly notice the driving states that appear to give the flock its dynamics. So, by analogy, witnessing the motion of what we call intelligence, we can perhaps understand it to be driven by absential features. And again, I will remind of this a few times. What I'm describing does not change what active inference already says about uncertainty. It is the perspective that I'm proposing here that changes. So instead of considering intelligence as something representational and visible, we can consider it as a dynamical process driven by the actualization of states, which can be understood as highly improbable, unattainable, inaccessible, etc. At first, from the first perspective, right? Then it effectuates itself, and these things stack up to different levels of complexity. In the same way that we do not change what the optical illusion in the previous slide was as an image, we change ourselves, right? As we witness different ways in which it can be seen as. And this is how illusions, for me, kind of connect to how we think of patterns. Illusions allow us to understand that perception is subject to a whole range of different dynamics in the service of surprise minimization, but it also sort of, because we can modulate this, we also understand what it is that perception is doing, and in the same way we can understand ourselves effectuating all these different conceptual dynamics as something comparable, where it is not really something that is there, but it's something that can be sustained as an illusion and produces the capacity to see as at many different levels. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways in which we may couple two things, and all optical illusions, all perception is evidence to this capacity to modulate ambiguity, right? The tendency to simplicity and parsimony, I would say as a scientific preference, is that incidental detail can be removed in favor of reliable repetition. However, this is the dangerous bit. We can never be too sure how skewed or spuriously correlated our perception of highly abstract patterns may be. At the very speculative edges, I always suspect the reason that we cannot arrive at final answers or conclusions is that there's either something fundamentally at odds with how we have evolved representation, or that there is indeed an attractor we have not yet found. Hence my interest in designating something the negintelligible as that which resists intelligibility. And this schema that I just presented can remind us, of course, of this mortal computation schema as presented, the 5E layers as presented in the paper by Carl in Ororbia, where at the top, the very end of that which is extended, which would include, for example, conceptual structures out there in natural language systems and formal systems. This can be understood, as subject to changes in epistemic frameworks, which can be constrained by, again, what we call the negentelligible, in the sense that vast systems overlap and explain each other cyclically. This was observed in the context of language, of course, by Wittgenstein famously, or by Derrida as well. If concepts follow the same laws as their lower level dynamics, then they must exist as nested levels of attractors. And additionally, if a creature should continually seek out observations that support or are internally consistent with their own continued existence, then it's immediately obvious that since human beings are ready to die, for example, for other human beings or even for ideas, this phenomenon cannot be cast as an internal agent-based dynamics only, but a vastly diffuse and sparse systemic process. If we must understand intelligence as a process effectuating itself through systems such as agents, then it must have some kind of evolutionary attractor. So to kind of exemplify something about conceptual change here, the concept of entropy was itself introduced by Rudolf Clausius in 1865 to be able to speak of the observable effects of transformation that go beyond heat transfer. So he said, I propose to call the magnitude S the entropy, the Verwandlungsinhalt, the morphing content of a body. I have intentionally formed the word entropy so as to be similar as possible to the word energy. The entertaining analogy then that we draw here is that if entropy tends to a maximum, which is a pattern based on the pattern that the energy of the universe is constant, and in negentropic systems such as ourselves, the constant pattern that can be understood as the structuring, uncertainty, minimizing effects of all that is rendered intelligible, from understanding each other to creating systems such as language, techno extensions all around. All that is rendered intelligible is that things can be explained, that latent relations can be inferred, that parsimony can be achieved. This tends then, I would say, to the negintelligible. So that would be the transformation potential of the intelligible, pattern restructuring. Misrepresentation is, of course, sensitivity to error in a generative model. And in a complex system which includes the entirety of the human biological community, these representations and misrepresentations are subject to highly contingent variables, as, for example, here exemplified by the Shannon and von Neumann apocryphal exchange, where Shannon advises Neumann, where von Neumann advises Shannon to take advantage of a community's unknowing. This is kind of humorously presented here, but it's also a very serious consideration to be made. So, what makes pulling all of these effects into a single concept is, as I mentioned earlier, then we can speak of negintelligible phenomena spanning philosophy. So, for example, how philosophy has considered and eternally reconsidered the notion of contingency, or things spanning cognitive science in the context of salience and ignorance in perception, or, for example, in the context of artistic production, where the avant-garde is that which resists the established parameters and continually invents the new. In the context of psychoanalysis, we can think of concepts such as lack or the unconscious, and the non-transparent self. In mathematics, the question of invention versus discovery, like what is it that is being kind of frictionally explored at the edges there. Concepts such as acceptation in biology as well, the evolution of function, right? In linguistics, of course, the reality-language duality, misrepresentation, mismatch. And even in religion, where something like a negative theology, right, that a god can only be described by everything that it is not. And this has been said of plenty of things. Korzybski also, like, whatever life is, whatever you say it is not, for example, or the map is not the territory, the model, the math is not the territory, etc. So this would be a kind of very, very soft and general concept for a principle of maximum uncertainty as kind of indifference biased towards indifference, which sets just more explicit focus on what I see as tacit or fundamental in driving whatever it is that we're calling intelligence. There are no easy benchmarks for intelligence because intelligence, like any other adaptive byproduct of evolution, is guided by how it manages to survive, contingently imposed or self-incurred risk-taking, which under active inference are both the same, arguably. And this creates a kind of strange loop or metacognitive condition through pattern structures that are diffuse across agents. In systems such as science, where no static representation can do justice to transformation, arguably, because notoriously, by definition, transformation evades representational capture, which is why we have to do with probabilities, and it's in their capacity to misrepresent and to be the differential possibilities that we get possibilities for action and disambiguation. So how does negintelligibility then redress the naked emperor? I think I've already mentioned it enough, but I think repetition is key here because I'm trying to drive at something which may be blatantly obvious to some and very confusing to others. So this is why a lot of repetition is to be expected to drive the point home. My interest in conceptual engineering is not just my philosophical inclination, but can be compared in a way to the Bayesian explanatory reversal that is at the core of active inference. So instead of sticking with existing static accounts and trying to match concepts to reality by asking how does concept A help explain phenomenon B, we go from, given that concepts exist and are known to transform over time reflecting ever-changing phenomena, how can concept formation itself yield attention to or yield novel phenomena? So the original idea behind the proposal stemmed from the observation that I just mentioned, that across a whole range of traditions and modes of thought, we observe this sort of conceptual proposal for things that do not settle and that always imply absences, ignorances, excesses, negations, etc. So the effects of uncertainty that actually transform concepts and therefore knowledge production. In this way, by providing a concept that encapsulates all these effects, to speak very generally about them, we might become more observant of this as a larger attractor, and also we might be able to translate between different fields in a novel way. Yeah. So attention to these essential features, to constraints, which also has a very recent and interesting history, the notion of constraint, of course, limits, negativities, etc., reflect the intelligent tendencies towards the productive in absences, in the generative in negations, the creative potential of what is missing, sort of unknown, everything that is beyond intelligible representation. Knowledge emerges from the gaps, from the tensions, from what lies at the bounds of current understanding. This is, again, inherent to active inference, but has no general concept, except as surprise-seeking or modal plasticity or other definitions which are specific to local descriptions and cannot be spoken about in general, especially when translating between domains. So, of course, we know that a complex model adapts by optimizing representations, but as it does, it transforms to exceed its prior representational limits in different ways, by reduction or expansion. Once complex enough models come to house fundamental understandings of their own limitations, this creates a very, very strange attractor in every sense of the word. This is why this project also finds camaraderie with eruption theory and with the Rivas model, because of the hyper-prior. Someone is unmuted. If I don't know if there is like a possibility to ask them to mute. I don't know if you guys are also.
Yes, Michael,
Oh,
do you
sorry,
mind muting
Michael.
yourself?
Oh, thank you. I thought every time there was a question coming in, it was not. Thanks. Yeah, so in the context of the Rebus model, apparently increased model plasticity or hyper-prior retuning or prior retuning under psychedelics and or eruption theory in the context of Freuse's work. Both of these signal the relationship between temporary increases in brain entropy and ensuing adaptations, which can be understood as adaptive always retroactively, right? If succeeding after risk. So for example, the risk of taking psychedelics itself. These success parameters we normally ascribe to intelligence, like high sensitivity to complexity or the capacity to change as new evidence appears, for example, have a tendency against themselves, it would seem, as they result in model change effectively. So they result in changing what the thing thought it was in many senses. So in the context of eruption theory, we can frame eruptions as Fruse puts it, as bursts of arbitrary changes in neural activity, and this unruliness increases, of course, more attentional, motivated, resolving effort because more options are available. The more entropy there is, right? More options are being considered. And we could speculate that it's maybe limits like sleep, which reflect the larger constraint of gravity as a big attractor, wearing us down, as well as creating the circadian rhythm as the world turns, or the compressive smoothing of ocular saccades, which reflect how physiology solves a perceptual problem of possibly infinite regress, and other shortcuts in organic experience as different copings or couplings with the same effect. Interruptions, not unlike the idea of eruptions, are precisely what makes the system capable of coupling, right? Much like noisy grain is needed for photographic film to be able to capture higher order patterns. In the context of the Rebus model, well, we can think about how this provides an interesting hypothesis for exploring how experiences of consciousness can be characterized by measurable degrees of entropy, where greater uncertainty, unpredictability, and information richness should correlate with primary or unconstrained models of consciousness. And in these high entropy states, observable during states such as psychedelic experiences, dreams, or early psychosis, appear to contrast with the low entropy and ordered cognitive functioning of standard waking secondary consciousness, right? These entropy fluctuations can be understood as a sort of dynamic management of model evidence, where, for example, in the context of my voice, ingesting psychedelic compounds, we can disrupt the hierarchical predictive mechanisms that normally constrain prediction and cognition, perception and cognition. And of course, something important to remark is that this adaptive control is what we often observe as coherent when it maintains social, communicatively established patterns. So for better or for worse in many ways, for in solidarity or under oppression, we can think about this. The relaxation of beliefs in primary states means partly decoupling, right, if only temporarily, from the coarse graining of social communicative frameworks, as well as from other habits of motivated agency or perspectival perception. And the intersection here between active inference and primary experiences, as explored by Carhart Harris, provides a framework for understanding this sort of anarchic brain and its effects on longer lasting effects on cognition. So, well, I think this is everything that I wanted to say about this. Otherwise, I'd take it in another direction. There's only 10 minutes left. So, of course, again, we can reframe this thinking about highest information gain and entropy production as epistemic manufacturing. Thinking again about conceptual plasticity here. So the highest entropy distributions should give me the most information about the world, obviously. Sampling the world in this sense displays as many varieties as there are creatures or individuated things, arguably, in the universe. But seeking out surprise has its limits, hence the different varieties. All entities evolve to enhance or reduce some aspect or, another in reality. So reading and writing the universe through uniquely evolved characteristics. In the case of conscious human agents, there are layers and layers and layers of diffused preferences, and most of these are inaccessible to the narrative sense of self and to the community as a whole. We depend on each other for meaning to actually emerge rather than it being located in any one single agent. The interest here, again, in presenting a concept like negintelligibility is highlighting the absential features and non-knowledge which drives the construction of knowledge, reverting the image from an agent seeks surprise to a massive attractor shapes surprise seeking. And this is, again, simply our entropic condition, but can be conceptually reframed as presented here for intuition pump purposes. So to just rehearse this one more time, if it wasn't clear from what I've been presenting, epistemic or ontological incompleteness is a prerequisite, of course, for creative, intelligent adaptations. No dark room possible, or all solutions are dark Bayesian rooms, essentially. And no system can survive if it's too rigid, right? Embedded in a dynamic universe. This adaptation occurs at the boundaries of knowledge systems, which are diffuse, adaptation in the context of sociolinguistic beings, which are diffuse, regenerative, and evolve over time spans outliving any one agent, right? These are our mortal limited computations, but also importantly, our 5E cognitive conditions, which are related to the mortal computation proposal. Because no system can contain or represent itself to itself in full, all these effects often involve recursion, self-reference, or some kind of apparent paradox as knowledge production confronts its own representational limitations. These are the model limits, right? There is no perfect model. In fact, this would be, of course, impossible if things are differentiated from each other in terms of dissipative gradients. And as opposed to the idea that the unknown simply awaits discovery or invention is driven by the very idea of the unknown, exploration as driven by surprise, right? If reality were either completely random or composed entirely of predictable patterns, then cognitive systems would not have evolved. In the first case, there would be no use for prediction. In the second case, there would be no need for prediction. And this is a corollary of the free energy principle in the universe as we know it. So in light of structural learning as representing something about latent structure, the question about decision or selection or agency remains puzzling if bounded by inaccessible uncertainties at all levels. Is it not more parsimonious to speak of an attractor directing attention towards model complexity reduction then? I think I will skip part of this slide, but this is just to say that, for example, in the context of how this philosopher presents it, and as we know, prediction is not the same as explanation, and he contextualizes explanation as the competence to use concepts. But what is the use of concepts, right? I've been trying to sort of make some kind of claim for what our use of concepts is. And of course, this is not by any means clear as of yet. So the fact that we have to move one funeral at a time, also another famous presentation of how science advances, or the moving goalposts or conceptual transformation. A lot of situations present themselves to conceptual creatures like us, major life changes which bootstrap conceptual capacity in a weird way. Beliefs are challenged to the maximum if we need to entertain the possibility that there are limits to model adaptation. So the assessment of how to compare and assess alternative hypotheses is very much defined by the context, in the sense that this assessment is not up to the agent, not only because it inherits conceptual dynamics in a chain of previous speakers, but especially because it has limited time to do so. And in the context of philosophy, I always like to remind my colleagues and others that we are extremely privileged in the time and resources that we have for offline structured learning, whereas most other human conditions do not enjoy said time to reflect as much. So, excuse me, I remove my presenter view, and now there we go. I lost my text. Comparing this this turning of perspectives, I sort of course, like to think about the fact that information compression is, of course, always observer dependent, and preference for actions that minimize expected free energy, that's model refinement or structural learning towards allostatic adaptation. This is subject to many, many multi-layered effects which are intractable from any perspective. And in this way, all perspectives therefore tend towards their intractable or negintelligible limits conditions. This is not saying anything new, but it's just setting the focus on something else. It's setting the focus on the non-salient and the non-apparent. And my main question here would be then, rather than concepts explaining reality? How does the evolution of concepts itself narrate new realities by playing at the very edge of model expansion and contraction? How might conceptual transformation itself serve as the generative mechanism for currently inexistent phenomena? Concepts, in my context, are dynamic evolutionary entities in their own right, rather than static tools. So it's therefore relevant to try and observe what it is that their movement produces or is attracted to. Instead of asking how concepts map onto intelligible phenomena, we can explore how new concepts, such as the negintelligible, for example, might reveal new territories. If concepts are therefore then not explanatory devices, but agents that bring forth their own domains, this presentation is perhaps evidence to that effect or idea. But yeah, instead of deriving concepts from phenomena, we can also seek to derive phenomena from concepts, would be the argument, which we can observe, in the nascence of a very basic effect in the context of illusions of all sorts, of course. Well, this was a slide to explain a little bit how abstraction and compression reflect both tendencies in science and philosophy, but I will skip it in the interest of time, because I think I've already mentioned quite a few of these things. And this one perhaps as well, because I think I am repeating what I already said a little bit. So the challenge in active inference is to find appropriate ways to model generative models, right? And arguably for reasons like not having to do things like testing on human subjects, for example. And at the heart of this are unobservable hidden variables in any attempt at modeling. So we can again just stop this presentation and say this negintelligible concept is nothing new. We can simply imagine it as the effects of generative noise, the effects of epistemic foraging under uncertainty, etc. But importantly, the way the world is for an agent can become a very strange thing if it wishes to include beliefs about highly time-sensitive and paradoxical phenomena, such as the very concept of artificial general intelligence and its possible future, or ideas about long-termism way beyond human ortho limits or perspective limits. The forward projection of an insatiable will to persevere that extends the mind beyond its own borders, like the project of AI, beyond what the mind even itself can consider mind or conceives as possible for the mind itself, means including within a model of itself a model of a highly non-trivial non-self occurring at the level of the total landscape of intelligence, right? When we consider it as intelligence as sort of the distributed effect of anything or anyone in the community of speakers engaged in the linguistic context that tries to speak of intelligence, which we can understand then because of this sort of eternally moving quality that it's drawn, that all of it is drawn in a way by the same negintelligible attractor. So the refusals and rebuttals of this could be why negintelligibility. What's the reason for this context? Oh my God, I keep saying context instead of concept all the time. Concept. It may over-intellectualize what is already obvious through a mathematically precise account of observers. It's a kind of vague philosophical notion that may complicate rather than clarify. It's a possible category error. So active inference describes information processing systems as optimizing self-models, and negintelligibility names a sort of attractor driving intelligence. The tendency of models to change in response to prediction errors does not have to implicate another system. Even if disputed, we already have names for things like emergence, etc., which account for similar effects. And as mentioned, of course, the standard active inference account already tells of how the negintelligible circumscribes the limits of model and of model forming and adaptation. But then the reconsideration of this could be like, okay, over intellectualization could be, but then here we assume a false dichotomy between computational precision or formalizing precision and conceptual complexity and distributed conceptual complexity. This is precisely what we define intelligence to be, right? The capacity to maybe see infinity in a grain of sand and vice versa, to cite William Blake. Some of the most paradigmatic scientific changes, for example, statistical mechanics meeting information theory, have been known to emerge from conceptual crossover. and thinking of larger attractors constraining intelligent efforts, we could perhaps then formalize some productive aspects of representational failure in ways that enhance rather than detract from what is already established through active inference. On the notion of category error, fixed boundaries between levels of description are important, but they're illusory, and they should be regarded as generative illusions very much in the sense that I've been speaking of, enabling our capacity to see as, to witness the effects of perception rather than to just be subject to perception. What begins as a phenomenological observation often leads to formal discoveries. Think again, for example, of the concept of not again because I didn't mention it, but I want to mention it later, the concept of symmetry as unfolding through history. Speculative philosophy and science are not an incompatibility, but a productive research frontier, of course. And this idea of negentelligibility is meant to enhance the functional properties of complex adaptive systems. New names for old things makes new perspectives possible. I have no ambitions that this concept is taken up in any way. This is just to highlight these aspects for the purposes of this presentation, and then we will see. I've already mentioned much of this, so I'm not going to go into it. This is what I wanted to talk about with regard to symmetry, and just to point you to this very interesting case, if you don't already know it. I have it from Daston and Gallison's Objectivity book from 2007. They frame this concept, this phenomenon that I will show you in the next slide, as one of the main sort of examples that we can think mechanical objectivity through. So Arthur Worthington was trying to draw the shapes of water droplets, and this is what he saw through the naked eye. He was flashing a light and then drawing from the imprint on his retina. So here are the images that he figured at first by this technique. And then these are the images that, well, these are reproduced also in drawing, but they are from photographs that were taken of the same phenomena. And here, of course, what we can think about, what is super interesting to think about is, of course, I want to read perhaps the quote of Worthington himself, and then this will explain itself in the context of everything we've been talking about. So, I find records of many irregular or unsymmetrical figures. Yet in compiling the history, it has been inevitable that these should be rejected, if only because identical irregularities never occur. Thus, the mind of the observer is filled with an ideal splash, an autosplash, whose perfection may never be actually realized. My experience is that most persons pronounce what they have seen to be a regular and symmetrical star-shaped figure, and they are surprised when they come to examine it by detail in continuous light to find that this is far from the truth. I believe that the observer, usually finding himself unable to attend to more than a portion of the rays in the system, is liable instinctively to pick out for attention a part of the circumference where they are regularly spaced, and to fill up the rest in imagination. And that where a ray may actually be really absent, he prefers to consider that it has been imperfectly viewed. This opinion is confirmed by the fact that in several cases, I have been able to observe with the naked eye a splash that was also simultaneously photographed, and have made the memorandum quite regular through the photograph subsequently, though the photograph subsequently showed irregularity. This is obvious to us all, right? And we know what we are talking about here. I will skip this one. And this one, in the interest of time, we can come back to them later. I have also already said this, so I will skip it, but we can come back to it if needed in the Q&A. But it's important here to close with this idea of mechanical objectivity, and to think about our current representations and accesses to reality as perhaps subject to this very same dynamic that Worthington observed. So we have a rather recent bias towards mechanical objectivity. We have a biological preference and also cultural biases for language and technology as extensions of the mind, because we have been tending towards the attractor ever since some now untraceable mutation or series of combinations of mutations, right? It should be no surprise that we seek to evolve what we call intelligence through systems such as formal and natural languages and technology, which are arguably the same system. The sort of, the language expands and contracts in ways that if we were able to see their movements at larger, way more coarse-grained historical scales, we would see how new concepts emerge and older concepts pass on. And the imprecision between epochs and between users of language is precisely what grants language this capacity to evolve through mutation. So while many do not perhaps appreciate the supposed lack of explanatory power in a concept like emergence, which could be comparable to something like Elan Vital or other conceptual proposals, it certainly has had the capacity to bring to light a whole range of perspectives that have brought attention on the processual characters of phenomena and in perception in particular, which is leading to a whole new approach and apparatus of science. For example, the whole field of active inference itself, right? So I think it's in our interest to create perhaps faulty concepts, negative concepts, exploring inter-concept space through the large language model that is natural language communication itself. I have quite a few more things to say, but I guess I will leave it just with the questions that I wanted to throw at the group. Thoughts on the notion of pattern and its conceptual problem in the context of correlation. This idea of the turning of the table. So how can concept invention yield attention and or yield novel phenomena? The intelligible as quite literally a slippery slope in the sense that it tends toward the negintelligible. And the concept of illusion, as I've been bringing it up, including all sort of generative aspects of metacognition, conceptual sort of diffusion across agents, as productive seeing as a productive seeing as fulcrum, and any other thoughts and criticisms. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That was really amazing. Thank you. Michael and Carl, if you want to briefly applaud, because that was really quite amazing. So if you were willing to unmute for a second for a small round of applause. Well done, Sonia. That was really amazing. Well done.
Thank you. That's very generous of you to say. I'm not at my best in presentation terms because my eyes are completely failing me and I'm confused as I'm trying to read. So I'm sort of wayfinding as I go. It's a bit disconcerting, but thank you. I hope it was coherent enough.
I found it was, but then we'll see with Carl and Michael what they have to say. So at this time, normally we ask a few questions. I did actually have some, and then I can check if Michael also has some, and then we can let Carl give you his thoughts. The first question I had, and maybe it was obvious in your presentation, but I wanted to know if, given what you've presented, and understanding that concepts definitely are in a web and therefore relate to each other, and so, patterning and repatterning, ultimately, it's kind of the same thing, but would you say there's a difference between novelty and repatterning in a non-meta level way?
I think this is the sort of relativist fall that emerges from putting it this way. Like, novelty implies repatterning, but it is always dependent on the action that is relevant in that moment to sort of ensue from interactions between things. In the context of modeling the dynamics of something, let's say like a small thing with simply just visual perception in 2 dimensions, we can very easily, or we think about cellular automata and how you can sort of watch them unfolding. We can see the moments at which, for us, let's say the basic sort of perception of symmetry enables us to perceive moments at which they start doing something else. But in the context of complex systems such as communicating human agents, for me, the very kind of loopy, strange loop thing comes from understanding like, okay, so we have unambiguous measurements, for example, for the medical sciences to determine how where someone's blood sodium is at, or other comparable types of assessments that we want to make. But these are always in service of that person actually leaving the medical context, right? They're in the service of the person continuing their life in as many other ways as lives are possible in that context, which makes that's for me the sort of very natural coupling between something like a super strictly formalized measurement of blood sodium and something which might seem as distant as someone performing in a improvisational music context, but one enables the other one in a way, both in more ways than one. So yeah, it's all very much observer and context dependent. I'm sorry, it's a terrible relativistic answer. But I think that's why concepts enabling this capacity to see as, like to say, okay, so if you present something like the negintelligible, what does that do by framing all these other concepts, which can include, again, uncertainty, the presentation of novelty, phenomena that are contradictory in nature, things that sort of don't end and have infinite regresses across all fronts. Like all of these things continue to be challenging for cognition across all these different domains. Does a concept that kind of pull them all into one one sort of conceptual strategy help them perhaps make different fields communicate and bring attention to these things in novel ways? And sort of the stackings are so diverse and different that it's very difficult to say like, oh, does this help in any way? I'm still figuring out a lot of this. Is really the end of a lot of the aspects of my research, and so it's still very much open-ended. But yeah, I don't have a better answer than what I just gave.
No, but I think because it ties into the what you were presenting with the droplets. I forget the name of the
Worthington. Yeah.
Because I feel like, and in psychology we do identify this as well, right? Like there's a difference between discovering that there are dogs when you only thought that there were ducks and you had never seen a dog, and also considering that now you make a difference between considering that everything is a duck and now there is dogs and ducks, as opposed to also discovering that ducks never existed to begin with, and perhaps what you need to consider is another category altogether, and it has nothing to do with figuring out that there were dogs. And so it seems to me like those kinds of repatternings are qualitatively different if you consider scales. Because in the concept of the droplet, he's right that no droplet is fully symmetrical, but the symmetry emerges at the level of the concept of a droplet, and at the specific fact that they all sort of abide by this rule that none of them will be symmetrical. And so if you start considering that, you start seeing that the shift in pattern is always, like you said at the beginning, which is this shift in scales at which some things can now be considered to repeat. But it makes the difference between considering that there's a dog and there's a duck when you had never seen a dog. Yeah, I guess the next question, and then I'll bring it to
Can I mention something really quickly regarding what you just said? So like in thinking about this example again, or what I mentioned about the flock, what we see, right, are what we actually see are the attractors in a way that perception produces to understand what how to best minimize uncertainty about droplets falling, for example, here. What we see in the bird flock is also which points the birds are attracted to, rather than seeing the. Oh, I can also admit. And so what I'm saying here is like, what I kind of have seen by through my incursions into all these domains, looking at, I don't know, improvisation in musical practice, or looking at the history of art, which at least in the Western context proceeds by this sort of algorithm that says like, no, you need originality, you need novelty, and then generally the things that are not appreciated or accepted at first become the mode later, etc. What we can see with something as kind of banal as saying, all of these things are negintelligible, is that we're looking then at the sort of quite an interesting thing that can be considered a large-scale attractor driving the things that we consider in this context of the sort of Western European tradition of science, intelligence, right?
Mm.
So, yeah.
No, absolutely. And so then I guess, so you said at some point that intelligence, in a sense, is self-recursive, but also entails relational properties. And I think you implied it was between agents. And so I guess the question has to do with this, which is, one, could you consider that since it's self-recursive in a sense, you can otherize yourself and create a form of intelligence that doesn't require other agents than yourself through this sort of diffraction that you create in yourself? And then the second part of this is assuming that this is limiting effectively because you can only compute so much, you can only acquire so much, you can only see so many scales at once. Engaging with more and more people entails that you will have access to potentially these sort of superstructures like ideology, which may not have been available to you if you were alone. It's a fundamentally social concept, but that ultimately there's organizing principles that both lose information and also allow us to see more and more and more scales. And at which point does the loss of information become sort of negintelligible as well? So yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, totally. This is this is for me why I tend to confuse people when I don't contextualize this by saying like I'm trying to look at things very, very abstractly in the sense that sort of we can think about really, really big spatiotemporal spans. You know, imagine, for example, the motion of the concept of entropy as evolving, you know, from its inception, you know, a century and a half ago to now, and see that motion. I don't know, that kind of engram representation of its different capacities and ways to travel, etc. But yeah, this of course the interests of a context will always determine what is then salient and intelligible. But now I lost what I wanted to say when you just mentioned the fact that the creation of a perspective that can dislodge itself from a community is something very difficult for us to try and imagine, because we are inherently bootstrapped by language and all sorts of other habitual systems as we go when we're born, right? There are impossibilities of studying this at the level of putting human subjects through, you know, like isolation, for example, experimentation before they are exposed to any. That's something that we do not do, which is why there's a lot of promise in the context of kind of trying to understand the dynamics, the unfolding sort of conceptual capacities of cognitive beings like human beings through active inference, so that we may do this without actually doing this to humans. But that's the weird thing, that's where we should pay super special attention to our concepts of sameness as occurring between human beings, what it is that we consider to be, you know, applying to the human species across all traditions and histories, etc. It's just a very delicate object that should be treated as such, and that's why philosophical speculation is the step before doing modeling, right? To say like, what are we really talking about when we say A, B, or C? Then we can model, then we can sort of perhaps still understand the normativity of everything that we do as a limiting constraint, but also at least we see it as, you know, we understand it as normativity rather than just effectuating it or performing it, which is a lot of the the performing of normativity without being aware of doing that is what has been one of the main problems of science, as criticized from the perspective of the philosophy of science through different thinkers.
Thank you. So, Michael, did you have any question or comment for Sonia?
Well, thank you. I wish I did, but I don't. I'm quite fascinated by everything that you've done. Unfortunately, I was delayed and came in a little bit late. but what you're trying to tackle is something which very few people actually are afraid to go to, but extremely important. So I'm happy that you did that, but I don't have a specific question at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm taking risks all the time, and that's both good and bad, as we know, for explorative agents. Thank you.
So I imagine that it'll be the same for most people that joined a little bit later. So if you feel like you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I will simply now open the floor to Carl to give his thoughts.
Good. Is it my turn now?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. I'm wondering, everybody seemed to arrive at 3:30 UK time. I'm wondering if there's some confusion about daylight hours or something. Yes, there's somebody else arriving. Good. Sorry, I got a bit distracted there by people joining us. Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. You're clearly extremely well versed in the theory behind the free energy principle and active inference and many other things. How long have you been doing this?
So I'm finishing the PhD now. I actually handed in already the manuscript that is just going to be, I guess, with some revisions by my supervisors, but it's been 5 years of doing that because I've been teaching on the side, so doing it over 5 years. And then I've been, through the work of Andy Clark mostly, introduced to active inference over the last 10 or more years, I would say. Yeah. And philosophy has been, yeah, my context mostly, so not formal modeling, but definitely the context of philosophy. Yeah.
Yes, yes. No, that was clear. Yeah, no. As I was intimating, that was a very impressive rendition of some fundamental ideas and unpacked in a philosophical context, which I should confess is outside my comfort zone. You use some words that I don't understand, but I assume you understand in the same way that, with the same veracity that you understand the technical stuff from the free energy principle. Yeah, there's so much to cover here. You've handed in your PhD thesis, so but I presume you'll be looking for sort of postdoctoral positions now that allow you to pursue this line of work. And I'm imagining that your main contribution outside the sort of teaching to art students and the like will be to the philosophy literature. So, well, I assume that's going to be things like sort of synthes or whatever the favored literature is at the present time. So in terms, what I'd like to do is just come back and make sure that we've answered your 4 questions at the end. But first of all, just make a few 5 questions, 4 questions and a request. First of all, just make a few general comments about things that resonated with me. And then run through a series of papers that I would be surprised if you hadn't come across, given the fact that you've been doing this for 10 years and have spent the past 5 years writing a PhD thesis about it. But there may be papers you haven't seen, but there may be certain perspectives that I think lend a substance to the arguments in the thesis. Specifically through the lens of a non-philosophical physicist's, effectively a physicist's perspective. So if one just keeps close to the physics, a lot of the things you said do re-emerge purely from the perspective of information theory and the fundaments of self-organization. So, I can't cover everything you mentioned, but certainly some key little points did, I repeat, resonate with what the conclusions that you would make if you just looked at intelligent systems evolving in a way, and then try to describe what properties those systems must possess in order for them to exist in those characteristic states. But before I do that, though, just a couple of points that I wanted to revisit in your conversation with Mao and in the final parts of the presentation. This, first of all, the importance of symmetry, and what I imagine you're referring to from this illusory perspective, as exemplified by the Worthington example with the droplets and the splashes that they make. If you now consider and specifically the point you were making was that we tend to perceive and possibly conceive of the causes of our sensations generated by these kinds of events as being platonic or canonical, emphasizing the symmetries. And the symmetry is probably not a characteristic of the actual event at hand. And that is so true in physics in a particular sense. And that sense is that the symmetry in mathematics and physics is usually read as an invariance. So it's not just translational symmetry or rotational symmetry. It is anything that is conserved or invariant. And in that sense, what would be the invariant, or how would you get at the invariant aspects over time, over multiple instances of an event that you might witness? And the best way and the simplest way of accessing that is to take an average, and the average basically averages away all the random fluctuations or variations on that platonic theme, and it just leaves you with symmetries, which could actually be rotational symmetry, but more generally it is just the invariance. So why do I express the link between symmetry and the average? I do that because, for two reasons. One, all of physics and all of psychology, or at least all of psychophysics and neurophysiology in neurobiology that speak to psychological issues, all of it is based upon an event-related average. So this goes from the double slit experiment in quantum physics and quantum electrodynamics through to event-related potentials in neurophysiology, through, in my world, to linear convolution models for functional magnetic resonance imaging. At every point, you are making an assumption that, at least probabilistically, the only invariance is that which survives averaging. So you wouldn't get the diffraction patterns in the double slit experiment unless you took the average over time. You would not get an event-related potential unless you averaged over multiple instances or events of the same class or kind. So I thought that might be worthwhile making, that it can be no other way. You know, said it from a physicist, and I would argue from a physiologist perspective, this is the stuff of reality. It just exists on average. That's also true in a much deeper sense, mathematically, from the perspective of the free energy principle. And if you now regard the free energy principle as a particular application, or vice versa, of things like James's maximum caliber or maximum entropy principle, then there's, if you like, an almost axiomatic and certainly first principle veracity to this notion. I'm aware this is being recorded, so you don't have to stay awake and listen to this in detail. You can go back and see if it's a useful soundbite for you. But the establishing that synchronization, that entanglement between you and your lived world under the free energy principle can be read as an inevitable synchronization, technically a synchronization of chaos or generalized synchrony. That is the free energy minimizing solution. It's not one solution, it moves in time, but it is, if you like, the mathematical image of what you were talking about in terms of the attractor. So you have an attracting landscape which is constantly changing. However, the system, the joint system, you and your lived world, are always tracking the minima, the flowing through free regimes of that have a very low free energy. And in so doing, they necessarily imply a synchronization between you and the system outside, or not you. Or the intelligible parts of the world and the non-intelligible parts. That's an overinterpretation of your negintelligibility. But that generalized synchronization is mediated by something called a synchronization manifold. So basically, if I project the world onto this synchronization manifold and I project me, my internal brain states, my belief updating, or the states that underwrite or parameterize my belief updating onto that manifold, they all lie on the same place. So this synchronization manifold exists simply because I am in some way coherent or have an adaptive fit to my world. Crucially, that projection or that manifold is not in the instantaneous variables on the inside and the outside. It's only true on average. So that mathematical synchronization manifold that underwrites a generalized synchrony, that is the free energy minimizing solution that things that persist in time must possess over a certain period of time, only exists in expectation or on average. So it's just the sufficient statistics of our beliefs and the average, or the most likely, the mode of a probability distribution over states and affairs of the world that are synchronized. The actual states and affairs in the world and all the possible beliefs I could entertain under a given Bayesian belief for probability distribution do not map. It's just the expectations of the averages. So I think there's, there are some deep physical principles that you can bring to the table to explain why droplets of this sort can only be seen with these kinds of asymmetry. And you could even argue that the photographs on the right-hand side, you have to search quite carefully to find the asymmetries by looking at different parts of the image and remembering them. So it's a highly constructive act. But in so doing, you're actually now appealing to another kind of symmetry. Oh, these look like the little spikes on the crown. They are now repeating themselves, so they still have this Platonic canonical form, even though they've now you've now broken the rotational symmetry. There's still a symmetry underneath, so the symmetry is all the way down. In relation to your question about patterning and your discussion about patterning, and you started talking about repatterning when tackling the issue of what it is to be in a changing world, and to be in a changing world, you have to change. And if your world is constituted by other things like you, then by definition and by circular causality, you're in a changing world. So you have to repattern all the time, simply because the world presents different patterns just because there are other things like you in it. I would, if I was writing that, I would actually call it structuring and restructuring, because then you can make if you're talking about patterning as an attribute of a process that you that applies to you, then you are restructuring yourself or repatterning yourself. And of course, now you can make the link to structure learning. And if you can make the link to structure learning, you can now say, well, there is an optimal structure that complies with the free energy principle in the sense that it has to provide an accurate account of all the things that I have seen and may see in the future that is minimally complex as possible. And I can approach this optimal complexity from the top or from the bottom. And when I'm approaching it from the top, that entails the simplification, the pruning, the reduction in the model complexity without sacrificing any accuracy. That it essentially allows me to carve nature at its joints in the right kind of way to find the simplest, make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler explanation for my world. The other approach is to de novo, from scratch, build a structure up to. In fact, let me indulge myself and I can use a graphic to illustrate that particular. If I go for the entire screen, yes, and hopefully you can see this picture now. This is a picture for a paper that is currently being written, but it did strike me that it was remarkably similar to your sort of levels of complexity that you were showing in the first part of the talk. But here we're talking specifically about model complexity. And just to highlight that there is some optimum that is a marginal likelihood of model evidencing maximizing or free energy, pattern free energy minimizing solution. And we can get to that by reducing and simplifying, merging different ideas, realizing that this theory was just a reincarnation of that theory, and that postulate was exactly the same as this conjecture, and in fact they're all like this. So basically merging and finding those symmetries, but now of a conceptual sort, that reduce the degrees of freedom you have to bring to the table to explain this or that observation. But the other way of doing it is to restructure, repan, and you have to be able to restructure if you start from below. So you have to grow your model now. You have to now entertain new structures, de novo structures that never previously existed, certainly for you. And that, I think, entails a certain kind of exploration which goes beyond the novelty. So I'm now speaking to something you said and discussed with Mal, that this is not just novelty seeking. Novelty seeking, as you well know, is simply selecting those policies or courses of action that have the maximum information gain, given my current posters about the contingencies of my world, the parameters of my generative model. So novelty seeking is always conditioned upon a particular model. Whereas what you're talking about is now optimizing the model structure in and of itself. So this puts I think a fundamentally different hierarchical scale on exploration. So we're now exploring the structure of our models in a way which it is not easy to do practically, and yet one could argue that that's basically why we're here, or certainly one teleological description of the way that we self-assemble and self-organize. So I think that sort of it's not really physics, but certainly from a mathematical perspective, it's worthwhile saying you're going beyond novelty learning. Now we're in the game of building new structures, restructuring the very scaffold, the very fabric of our generative models in terms of the conditional dependencies and the way that we carve nature into independent factors. To see if this is a good model or that is a good model. That's a very difficult problem. Hitherto has been largely entertained under the notion of non-parametric Bayes, but that wasn't terribly successful as a program. It's a very difficult problem. And you could argue that evolution has sort of largely given up trying to solve that problem, in the sense that we're usually equipped with overly expressive, over-connected, big baby brains, then spend the next 21 years pruning them away to get back to a sparse, wise, reduced, simpler explanations for our world. But clearly we do acquire new information, and we do acquire new structures, and we add things to our models. So I think that is, if you meant that the negenterpretability describes the space yet to be explored, and certainly defines the edges of the structures that have been entertained and evaluated and possibly pruned, the frontiers, as it were, relative to all the spaces of structures the space of structures that have yet to be explored, yet have to be explored in a very, very careful way, because obviously if you choose the wrong one and test it out, that's potentially quite a dangerous thing to do. But I think that is a fundamental mechanism that would presumably be recapitulated not just in introspection, but also in neurodevelopment and at an evolutionary scale, also at a cultural scale in terms of the way that science progressing funeral by funeral or standing on the shoulders of giants and all that good stuff. I think all of those do express this incremental exploration that I'm sure there are evolutionary sort of statements of the same kind. So I thought that was an important concept. A slightly more simplistic nod to this notion of negintelligibility would, I think, come from more simple understandings of the nature of self-organization, particularly through the lens of the free energy principle and maximum entropy principles, in that it's more important to avoid certain states of being that, in a sense, you said that things are defined, God is defined by what it is not. And I think you could also argue everything, and in inverted commas, is defined by the states it cannot occupy, because if it did so, it would cease to be that kind of thing. And mathematically, that sort of gets into the mix when you're talking about free energy, because free energy is negative log probability, self-information, or surprisal. It's basically a score of what you should not be as opposed to what you should be. So I'm very comfortable talking about minimizing free energy, which is basically a description of things that avoid being in states that they cannot possibly be in to be that thing. And that seems to fit very nicely with what I understood by some ways, by some framings of your negintelligibility. Of course, the converse is I just multiply by -1, and I've now got log evidence or log marginal likelihood, and I can be Jacob Howie and talk about self-evidencing. So you can either be a very glass half full kind of interpreter and say, yes, we're all self-evidencing, gathering evidence from our models, or you can say, no, we're just managing to avoid death, dissipation, and decay by ensuring that we're not in these states that cannot be occupied, given we are the kind of thing we are. And that more simple view, I think, again puts this exploration of model space, this restructuring or repatterning. It makes it, there are dangers of becoming something that you were not in the past, which speaks of sort of the evolution and the wandering through these dynamic Waddington or free energy landscapes. So that was that. But what I wanted to briefly go through, sort of, okay, in no particular order. A lot of your story, you were trying to emphasize that this conceptual approach should transcend scales of application. So it should extend or apply to illusory percepts, right through to cultural evolution of language and the like, and one should be able to identify the mechanisms that have this symmetry, that all the mechanisms that should also just emerge from the physics of self-organization. Or I don't know if you've seen this, but I think this is a really nice worked example from anthropology and archaeology that gets into the weeds in terms of cultural transmission and how you resolve the paradox that if we're all surprise minimizing creatures and we just inherit the symmetries from our parents, how do we get the emergence of novel behaviors such as hand axes in this particular example? And so I'm trying to unpack why, in fact, the emergence of these things is actually itself an emergent property, but when one looks at the different kinds of uncertainty and intelligibility and negintelligibility that from your perspective are at play, when one has the separation of scales between watching your conspecific or your father or some young axe wielder for the first time using an axe, where you're tempted to ignore that because you've never seen that happen before, and that could introduce all kinds of ambiguities and uncertainty, so you attend away from it, versus, oh, if I can attend to that, engage in novelty seeking, then I'm now in a position to pass that down to my children, or the use of hand axes will then disseminate within the generation. And then this paper just looks at this sort of archaeological evidence for, was this an inevitable process, as evidenced by the fact that hand axes actually emerge in different places in different worlds at different times. So it wasn't just one person found out how to use an axe and then that caught on. It doesn't look as though it's quite like that. It was inevitable at some point somebody would invent fire, or somebody would. The deeper question is, why on earth did anybody take any notice, and how did that get transmitted to the next generation? That's I thought an entertaining perspective. This paper I put up, again, just to reinforce this point that a lot of the philosophical arguments have their roots in, or can certainly be reframed purely from the physics of self-organization. And I noticed you took a lot of time and care to talk about the different kinds of entropy that one could consider, and also emphasize the yin-yang, that on the one hand, we want to minimize entropy as good homeostatic agents with a physiology. On the other hand, we want to go off and explore and turn the lights on in our Bayesian dark room in a way that's being information or uncertainty seeking in one sense. There's that intermediate notion that we want to keep our options open and not commit to a particular very precise explanation. So there's lots of ways in which entropy gets into the game here, and I think I think you did a very nice job at picking out all the different kinds of entropy, but I still suspect there's a need in the philosophy literature to actually make it very, very clear that these entropies are fundamentally different things. And that really hits you in the face when, before the free energy principle was even thought about, not by me, but even by people like Jeff Hinton, this paradox comes to the fore in this seminal paper, which was basically the introduction of something called the maximum caliber principle, or the principle of minimum path entropy, also known as max cal. So this is a really generic principle that describes how we measure things, but it's also been used in terms of time series analysis and statistics and data science. So I repeat, I've just said the maximum path entropy or caliber principle. And yet the paper in which this was introduced was called the minimum entropy production principle, as a nod to Prigogine and the formulation of the physics of self-organization, I suspect, in the early half of the 19th century. So again, you've got this bizarre statement. We've got, on the one hand, a maximum entropy principle that inherits from a minimum entropy principle. How does that happen? Well, I think the resolution, and I think it's probably worth explaining this to people, is that the entropy you want to minimize is not the entropy of your measurement or your symmetric illusory exploration or belief or observation in your head. It is the entropy of the sensory impressions from the environment. These are not random variables about which you make inference. These are real variables, biophysical variables, physical variables that impinge upon, for me, the sensory sector of your Markov blanket, or your sense organs, or your thermoreceptors, whatever you are equipped with. These are not random variables. These are, so you can't make an inference. There's no probability distribution of them. They are what they are. So the entropy as applied, the minimum entropy, applies to the distribution of these real variables over what? Well, I've just said they're not random variables. So then you realize, well, this must be over time then. So over time, this temperature sensor will change. And over time, it will have a probability distribution. And it is the entropy of that probability distribution that I want to minimize. There is another way, and this is probably going far outside your scope of interest, but I find it very interesting. There is another way to equip a physical measure, a physical variable, not a measurement, a physical variable that subtends your measurement with a probability distribution. That's to make a simplifying assumption that there are lots of them. I've got 1 billion sensory thermoreceptors. Or I've got 1 billion atoms in an idealized gas, let's say an Einstein solid model or gas model. If I now can assume I've got an ensemble of these things, which in real life we don't have, we've only got one eye, and but if I can assume there's an ensemble of these things, for example, 1 million photoreceptors in my one eye, then I now can have a probability distribution over this large number that I could sample from. And then that's the birth of thermodynamics. You get canonical ensembles, but thermodynamics read in terms of thermodynamic energy entropy and the kind of Boltzmann entropy that von Neumann was talking about, that actually is after this more fundamental entropy, which is over time. So the free energy principle is this sort of pre-thermodynamics, pre-physics, information theoretic structure of the world. So in fact, Shannon really was more foundational than von Neumann or Gibbs, because talking about the entropy of a system at one point in time makes absolutely no sense unless you have an ensemble over which to measure the probability distribution, which you have to do in order to have an attribute of entropy, which is an attribute of probability distribution. But over time, then that's perfectly okay. So you can minimize the entropy of your sensations over time by maximizing the entropy of your beliefs about the causes of those sensations. That's the first, if you like, and that's where the maximum entropy principle comes. It's not about the thing being measured. It's about the measurement process itself. It's a conclusion you reach on the basis of what you see or what you measure or what you observe, as opposed to the real variables of physical states. For us, the sensory states. So you're minimizing the entropy of your sensory states over time by maximizing the entropy of your beliefs in the moment. Now we have a double inversion. Now, when we come to acting, when we come to conditioning, when we come to inferring what we are going to do, because the observations that we want to upper bound in terms of their dissipation or their entropy have not yet occurred, they now become random variables because they don't exist. They're not real variables. So now we have to take the expected free energy, which is what you mentioned, the expected free energy, at which point your entropy is no longer, you don't want to minimize your entropy. Well, there is one relative entropy, which is the expected information gain. So you get this lovely inversion again. Now, although you're trying to maximize the entropy, maximize the uncertainty of your beliefs in the moment, when it comes to choosing something to do, you want to minimize that uncertainty in the future. And that explains the novelty seeking and the information gain. But we notice that only gets into play when you're considering the consequences of doing something. It's only pertinent to an embodied a system that is evolving in time and has some minimal agency or some true agency, authentic agency, in the sense that it's planning, it's actually evaluating the probability of these outcomes if I did that, and that then means that I will resolve my uncertainty or resolve my entropy in this particular way. And then you get to the fourth level we were talking about before, which is your repatterning or restructuring, the entropy of the uncertainty of the very model space itself, which I'll leave you to worry about that. But I always find this very amusing that you get this sort of minimum and maximum in the same papers, in the same sentences. It can get very, very confusing. You mentioned strangeness. Have you read this paper? No, you'd enjoy this. It's just that it takes you by the hand again, purely through the philosophy, purely through the physics, to end up with an explanation of things like you and me as strange things. And put very simply, the strangeness is is borrowed in part from strange attractors, but also as a nod to Hofstadter's strange loops, because there's a certain recursion that are characteristic of certain things that possess a Markov blanket, and in particular, when these things get sufficiently big so that the inside can't see the actions directly, the actions now become random variables. So in the same sense we're talking about before, that the sensory states are not random variables, but they are when they're in the future. Our actions are, again, not random variables. It's, you know, the movements that we supposedly make. But of course, if I get very, very big and have sort of lots of, you know, sort of Markov blankets between my effector organs or my actuators or my autonomic reflexes, and say me as you know, a particular distributed brain system, then I have no direct access to the actual action anymore. And now then it becomes a cause of my sensation. So now I infer it. So now I infer my own actions. And that means that now I'm an agent that has this sort of strange loop of causality, that I'm acting upon the world to cause sensations that I am then using to infer how I'm acting on the world. And then I'm acting in a way that minimizes my surprise, namely how I predict I act. So there's a strange loop of causality induced when you have this disconnect between action and your sense-making organ, your sense-making physics on the inside, your belief updating. And that strange loop basically can be easily summarized. These kinds of strange things plan. They have a generative model, look as if they have a generative model of their own future, and therefore I think would qualify as authentic agents. And that, to me, is, you know, that's how I would write down the strangeness. You also get from this a certain autonomy, in the sense that now, because I can plan what to do in the future, I now have true autonomy. And if I use autonomous differential equations to model my future, I now almost universally have strange attractors in my head, central pattern generators, for example, that cause us to walk and talk and speak and breathe and everything. So there's another way in which strangeness gets into the mix. So if you like maths, then you'll like this paper. So that was that one, about strangeness. This is just a nod to something that you said before, and again, I think even for those people who are very fluent with active inference, I think it's important to remind them that there's the things that motivate our behavior in terms of just resolving uncertainty via epistemic exploration or responding to epistemic affordances are very distinct from the attentional mechanisms that can be cast in terms of precision control of the kind that underwrite the Rebus hypothesis. You know, these are two very different kinds of mechanisms. One is about estimating the uncertainty, possibly, well, you know, the uncertainty or the precision in the moment of what's going on and how I should make sense of it. And that would be the sort of precision-based account of attention, and it's concurrent and a description of how we deploy precision in the moment, versus the novelty seeking or the salience that underwrites behaviors which resolve uncertainty about states of affairs, are fundamentally different kinds of mechanisms which this paper is meant to highlight. I mentioned that because a lot of your talk was about exploration, curiosity, and possibly even creativity, if extended in the right kind of way. And I think that's rests upon a different kinds of mechanics that's peculiar to these strange things that can plan. Whereas the rebus hypothesis and taking psychedelics, you can plan to take psychedelics, but the actual taking of the psychedelics is to induce a particular brain state where you're now just attending effectively to the sensorium as opposed to all your preconceptions and prior beliefs. So there's no planning involved other than planning to take the psychedelic. So the two different kinds of effects that can be cast in terms of uncertainty, but one is the attentional rebus precision-based account is really trying to it talks about the entropy of your beliefs in the moment in terms of a maximum entropy principle or free energy, that minimizing the variation of free energy, whereas the epistemic, more salience part, and the exploratory part that depends upon action, that's the converse. That's trying to minimize uncertainty or minimize entropy through information-seeking behavior. Just technically, there is an entropy minimizing or relative entropy maximizing. No, there's not. So you can decompose the risk term and see where the entropy maximizing part gets into the accepted free energy, but I think that'd probably be more confusing than it is clarifying. Oh yes, I presume you've seen this because this is you talk about building models and there was something particular. Oh yeah, no, it wasn't. No, you covered everything. It's just that this exercise in model building did have a sort of nice, a comprehensive labeling of all the different kinds of exploration in terms of novelty and information gain about the parameters versus the states of affairs or the latent states. But I think you're well on top of that, so we don't need to worry about that. Oh, again, I think this paper, I haven't read it for some time, but it was written by somebody who has a sort of very biological view of intelligence, and Thomas and I were solicited to sort of just advise on the paper. But it talks specifically about biological intelligence, but I think it's all about sort of just getting the precisions right, which would be one part of your grander thesis, speaking to more the sort of the rebus part and the potential liberating effects of suspending your prior beliefs for a while that sets the scene to explore other and to do the restructuring possibly. But I can't remember. It just came out a few weeks ago, so I thought you might. It might be useful for you to have a look at that. No, coming at that. I'll come back to that. Have you gone through this federated inference and belief sharing? Yeah, excellent. Okay, so one of the reasons I put that up was because you were talking about complexity a lot, and when you said complexity, I was just sort of reading that in terms of the statistical complexity that you can decompose when you decompose log evidence or free energy into accuracy and complexity. But I also got a sense that you were talking about the structural complexity inherent in the sparsity of coupled dynamical systems like you and me, that tend to also, in the search of minimum statistical complexity, evince an increase in the structural complexity in virtue of having a sparser and sparser, more refined kind of coupling, and that itself should be an emergent property in terms of joint free energy minimization or joint self-evidencing. And this is why I showed that paper, just to show that the structural complexity does indeed increase over evolutionary time in this context. Good, so let's get rid of that one. Yeah, again, I presume you've read this because you're talking about multi-scale. Okay, so well, I mean, you're not going to learn very much from this, but it's just a nice technical reference if you wanted an example. So it's actually, as I thought, Daniel, you'd spoken to Daniel Friedman. Yeah, well, he was the second author on this one, so he should have sent it to you. Anyway, it's an application of the free energy principle explicitly on multiple scales using the renormalization group, and just says exactly what you were saying, that you cannot uncouple self-evidencing or adaptive processes at one time scale from the context instantiated by a slow time scale. But what you can do is just reapply the same principles at both scales, and then think about how the one scale couples to another scale. And one obvious one, of course, is evolutionary dynamics. So this is just a treatment of theoretical biology, namely evolution, where we're applying free energy minimizing mechanics or dynamics to the evolutionary scale and to the phenotypic scale, and in particular looking at how one scale informs the other and showing how things change slowly in time. So this is exactly the way that you would deal with this itinerancy, where your attractor is itself where you are, your attractor is itself changing its structure and its shape, in virtue of slowly changing control parameters of that attracting manifold, basically those that shape the free energy landscape at this point in time. Whereas those order parameters, to use a synergetics term, are themselves now moving on an attractor at a much slower time scale. So you've got sort of one attractor that's moving very, very slow, one state moving very, very slowly on an attracting manifold at one coarse grain scale, and that's now supplying the parameters that determine the structure or the patterning of your attractor at a faster, smaller scale. So one reading of that would be that you've got genetic drift at the higher scale. That is a lawful expression of something that converges to a free energy minimum. Itinerantly, that is now supplying the parameters for a phenotype, namely in terms of the epigenetics. And then the phenotype now maximizes its marginal likelihood, and therefore is then, if you like, sends back the evidence to the higher scale in terms of the population, the gene pool, for example. So you can read this as just a coupling between different scales when they both have their attractor dynamics, and it has a worked example at the level of dendrites right at the end, should you be interested. And the final, no, we've done that one. That's good. The final one is basically the paper which have you read this one? Yeah, I was going to say, for me, this is the paper that actually introduced Bayesian model reduction, and introduced structure learning as being creative in the sense of exploring different structures or patterns, causal patterns, cause-effect patterns, and testing them while you're asleep or while you're introspecting in order to get a better explanation for the world. So it had everything in it that you talked about in the first half of your talk, but you've seen that, so that's absolutely fine. Good. So can we just make sure that we've addressed your questions?
I think so. Let me have a look here. Yes, absolutely. Just looking at them again, you went through everything. Yeah, there were some things that I wasn't aware of, and a few papers that, of course, I kind of took for granted because of presenting in your context, and referred to them and the insights from there. So, but the other ones, thank you very much for the suggestions, because it's great food for thought. Yeah, Mao had to leave.
Yes, I know.
So this is
right. Yeah. So normally, what would happen now is that Mao would make sure you got no more questions, and then she would invite us all to unmute and give you a final round of applause. So I shall have Michael and Meran, if you'd like to applaud our guests. Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. No, really, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you all for being here. I think we're right on time then with here in Rotterdam 5:30. Oh. And thank you for your attention. Really, I was nervous also because of this problem with my eyes, that reading is difficult, and so articulating I mean, like in this weird introspective self-examination all the time, which adds complexity to presentations. But no, really, thank you. Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, tell us how to come back and tell us how you get on in the years to come.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.